it's like you put it in your hand and you just kind of know what to do with it.
I think you're right. The usability and lowering the barrier of entry for users, not to necessarily have to be technical. And for anybody that has known Jack long enough, we talk about that often in how we've thought about building Sonar too. Jack's very, very technical, has a very technical background. I'm not as much. I have a big Salesforce background, but certainly by any means not an engineer by trade. So, but it's still, again, lowering that barrier of entry and lowering that bar so that users of all walks of life can use this without having to have formal coding backgrounds or a formal education behind it. So switching gears real quick, we're going to talk about our companies and really about our sort of theory behind it, much less about some of the functionality. Love showing some of the functionality, which will show up here in a second, of how we're actually putting it into products. But more important than that, how are businesses starting to think about this? And Henry, you and I were catching up about this kind of right before starting the webinar. But how is Apollo thinking about leveraging this technology and how it's going to ultimately change how your business uses it, but also how your customers are using it?
Yeah, so I don't know how many Apollo customers in the audience, or who's at least familiar with Apollo, but we're in beta on some of our kind of phase 1 AI deployments, and it's super exciting. So I think, like, in a nutshell, like Apollo users for prospecting and engagement and like ways to find new customers. And like everyone in ops has been through the kind of like OG version of that, which is like scrape some lead lists, data load it into your CRM, clean it out, push it into some other platform, write some sequences, hope that sales engage with it, pull it back in. Like Apollo up until now has put all of that in one pane, which has been great. But when you start layering in AI to help you on that, it starts to get really, really powerful, because what you can do then is let AI run that kind of early sales process for you. So you can let it write the emails. You can let it write the subject line. It can A/B test and then learn from not just you, but from the entire user base. It can learn from like success rates versus different persona types. So like if you email a CTO, generally very succinct, detailed, like hyper-targeted, hyper-specific. If you email a VP of sales, 3 lines. Like those trends are pretty common. It will pick up on those and it will run with them like more so than like your typical person would have time to do. But then the phase 2 is like plays. So it's like, okay, now it can write the emails. It can identify like your persona. It can trigger based on certain actions which either happen within your like CRM or your CDP. So like someone changes jobs, which like Apollo can tell it, and that person happens to be a persona match. So then taking what's on your website and like your core value and like your value prop, email that persona based on that trigger that's happened. And like you can set up hundreds and hundreds of plays and AI will run those again and again and again. And then the really cool thing is like the third phase, which is letting it respond for you. So it will take that email back in, and if the response is super high on like the disposition and sentiment, then it will just pass it to sales. Great, like you've got a really warm lead. Otherwise, it will try to work that lead into a warmer lead for you. It will respond back. It will kind of nurture it. It will do all of the kind of stuff that takes quite a lot of time for sales reps, so they can focus on mid to down funnel work. And you have this kind of like AI wingman doing all of the manual stuff for you and freeing up a ton of time and a ton of productivity. And that's where it gets super exciting.
I completely agree. I think the biggest impact that it's making for anything is the fact that we actually now, fewer things will drop through the cracks. I think if we're leveraging this technology the right way, I think we're going to be more responsive. We're obviously going to be more well prepared for how we go and talk to customers and support those. But at that same time, just having that assistant, like you said, kind of having that sidekick to help you further mobilize around what your daily job is. And more than anything, we talk about this in the operations space all the time. Henry, you and I've had a webinar about this exact topic before. Being more focused on the strategy side of your business, whatever your role is, whether you're in sales and ops and Salesforce administration, you still want to be thinking critically, not just thinking tactically and how do I backpedal on things, but think more strategically on pieces. So if we take this technology and actually allow it to work the right way and free up more time in our day to allow for more deeper thinking, I think that's hopefully the biggest outcome. Jack, this is fun. A fun question to ask you, because we've been working on this now for months and actually just released it. How are you thinking as our chief product officer and just being such product backgrounded and focused? How are you thinking about leveraging it now and what we're going to start doing with it more in the future as well?
Yeah, so I think the best description I've heard for it from a product perspective is sort of SaaS 2.0, meaning synthesis and analysis as a service rather than just pure software. And I thought that was a really succinct way of describing what's going on here. But it really takes what Henry was describing in that AI has sort of been on this hype cycle for a long time, and being close to tech, I've always seen it kind of working, but it either was vaporware or it took dozens of data scientists and years of data finagling to get anything remotely production ready. And now that we have just I think you can be up and running with OpenAI's ChatGPT functionality in less than 15 lines of code for a really simple use case. And to me, right, that just means that the amount of use cases that we can tackle is really, really large, which is really exciting because it's finally delivering on this AI hype that's been going on for close to a decade now. And so with that synthesis as a service kind of principle, undermining undergirding what we're trying to do with the product. Obviously what we started with is just people hate documentation. Let's automatically document as much as we can. Sonar has so much context around how Salesforce is configured, how different systems are configured, that we're able to quickly and easily understand things like Apex, what are discrete units of code actually doing without having to be technical and understanding it. Brad's got an example up here. We can take contextual information about formula fields and really quickly understand what they're doing without having to go through and actually having to grok the raw formulas itself. And so we wanted to make that human element that typically is super time consuming, requires synthesis, and automate as much of that as possible so that you're not spending your time doing these sorts of rote tasks over and over again. And so that's really the foundational piece. But for us, right, then you can point it at other problems. So some things I've been exploring are what if we could automatically generate release notes based on code changes that we identified within a certain time period? Or what if we could generate project briefs based on certain changes that you're proposing in a sandbox? There are all sorts of ways to aggregate contextual pieces of information that we have in the system, synthesizing those down, and then taking care of 90% of that repeatable rote work that while time consuming and mentally exhaustive, it's been done so many times before that these AI models are really, really incredible at doing most of the work for you. So from a product perspective, that's really how we're starting to think about things.
Totally. So much of it goes into the, not to be cliche, but work smarter, not harder. I was actually just in San Francisco yesterday having drinks with a customer of ours, Raheel Jetley, who was on last webinar we had last week about RevOps horror stories. But he was telling me the same thing. He's like, man, I'm using this every day in almost every task I'm doing. It's kind of my new starting point. And if I can ask at least a detailed question to use it as a starting point to prompt me to think differently about it, he's like, had I not taken that route and using it in my daily practice, and we'll talk about that actually here in a second, of how should operations team leverage it on a daily basis. But he was like, it has actually made me think differently about the task I'm actually doing because of the prompt that it's returning, which I absolutely loved. And so he's actually in a unique sense using this as a way of him learning as well and calling out spots that he might not have potentially thought about in his daily workflows. So kind of shifting into how we think about ops teams. And when we say ops teams, looking at a lot of the folks, see a lot of familiar faces and names in the group. A lot of Salesforce specific folks, a lot of revenue leaders on this call, a lot of, again, pure operations folks. What are some of the use cases we're starting to see and hear? Henry, I'll start with you about how your team's even thinking about this, or just some of the daily tasks that we can start incorporating by using this technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, as you guys have mentioned, is kind of work smarter, not harder. How do you take those things in the day that take a lot of time and either make them split second or like significantly reduce them. And like a couple of ways that like we've been doing it internally within the revenue operations, the systems, the analytics team at Apollo. So like my head of BI, a guy called Mike, he has integrated ChatGPT into our BI and RevOps intake process. So it will take the user story and the kind of request from the user and put together like a pretty comprehensive project plan of what needs to be done from a kind of data modeling standpoint. Yeah, there's some kind of like there's probably some gaps in there, like just as it learns, and we need to kind of teach that model a bit more to be fully effective. But I think like just as a starting point and not having to type that out for kind of 30, 40 minutes every single time is a huge productivity unlock. And that just helps provide like real-time automated context to anyone in Apollo who wants to see and kind of understand the roadmap in a bit more detail. I think another one, a really cool one, like so I got stuck as probably we all do it, like I don't know, midnight the other night, trying to kind of piece together something, and I managed to build with ChatGPT doing 99% of the work, pretty like comprehensive 4-5 step join SQL query for Snowflake to kind of get one kind of point solution analysis I needed that meant I didn't have to go to the team. I didn't have to like get it into a kind of roadmap and like use up valuable sprint points. Like that to me was a kind of super light bulb moment where you can just like save what would have taken 2 or 3 hours, and it was probably 3 minutes with a few kind of re-prompts just to kind of refine the query, plug it back into the workbook in Snowflake, check that it all made sense, go back, there's maybe 2 or 3 revisions, and like 10 minutes later, I think it was 4,000 or 5,000 characters. It was a massive query, and it was pretty great user experience doing that.
Well, that's exactly what Rahil just actually. Your ears were burning, man. We were talking about you. Just jumped in the chat and said that. How detailed was your prompting for that type of exercise for you to get to it?
Nothing complex. Just like as you would talk to anyone. I think that's the beauty of it, right? It's generative AI that takes like common language input.
Yeah.
So I think if you start the prompt as if you were doing a kind of user story and like intake request to your team, it helps to have the kind of API or like technical field name. It's not required. And what was really cool about it the first time is like I missed a few of them, and it said, I assume this is what it is, but you'll want to swap it up. So it really like catches a lot of the kind of the little details. And then like on the inverse of that, I've actually started going back in and taking like Salesforce has its kind of strange, nonsensical formula limits on characters. So ChatGPT will actually make it more performant and more efficient if you take a formula and say reduce this down, or if you take a query, drop it in and say make this query more performant from a runtime perspective. It's pretty good at doing that in like 1 or 2 seconds, which would usually take 15 to 30 minutes of kind of more manual work.
Yeah, I love it. Jack,
and then we were using the other cool one that I heard the other day was we and some customers were using it to ask like, what is my buyer persona? Like, this is my product. Build me some kind of core buyer personas that I can then build into my marketing stack. And like it would give you the demographic and like contact and account demographic cuts that you would need to be able to build that, and then you can experiment with that. So it's a really good kind of like leapfrog moment just to kind of get you up and running on something. You know, you want to experiment, you want to kind of iterate over it, and like anything like that always requires that qualitative feedback loop. And I think it is like the prompts, knowing what to kind of then like how to then take that output and action it. But it gets you up and running far quicker than anything I've seen before.
Totally. I think when you think about that business, or I say the business context, taking a step back, even taking our business hats off, and just the human context of it, of taking something very complex, very robust, and again, I don't say humanizing, but putting it into layman's terms of how things are operating, how you should be thinking about it, is spot on. None of this comes without a little bit of risk, and that's certainly the next piece that we'll talk about, because I've got my own perspective of this. Funny enough, having a conversation with my wife about it, who is not in technology, she's an attorney, which I'll share her point of view of it in a second. But there's certainly risks that are involved with using this type of technology. We'll segue into that, from an ops side, and even just from a day-to-day practitioner side. Jack, I'll start with you. When you start to think about some of the blind spots or potential risk in using this, what comes to mind, and how do you think about that, even from a product perspective?
Yeah, I mean, great question. Quite a few different things going on in the industry right now, from trademark and copyright challenges that are going to be interesting to play out in court. Personally, I think as it relates to ops, the most, like the biggest advice I could give to people, and it's sort of why you're seeing this UX evolve around this being more suggestion oriented rather than like pure dictation, is because it's wrong. Like it's a prediction, and just like people, these predictions can be incorrect. And so, personally, one of the biggest risks I see is people treating it as, or at least this iteration, as autopilot versus maybe more of a sidekick. And as an example, right, like you could ask it to generate a query, right? But if you are not at least familiar with the system, right, you could bring, you could cause some query to like be super, have super poor performance, and then like, increase costs astronomically, right? Like that's totally something that could go haywire. Or even worse, like you could use it to generate some sort of email response and then blindly send that off to your boss, and it's like wildly wrong and you look like an idiot, right? Like, so I think of it more as a suggestion, a starting point, a rough draft, and then that's where operations folks, I think, are really going to start to distinguish themselves, is when they can apply their own unique experience on top of that, refine it, and like Henry said, doing so in an amount of time that's an order of magnitude faster. But that's the biggest risk, because I see people giving it too much freedom to just, at least in this version, maybe it'll get better. But for now, it definitely needs. I would treat it more as a suggestion.
Totally. Henry, what do you think, risk-wise? Obviously, we know the risk and reward that we get out of it, and I think the reward is clear to me of how much we can leverage it, what we can do better in our jobs. But what do you think about when you start to assess some of the risks in using something like this?
Yeah, I like, to Jack's point, it's a suggestion. I think it's not. There's no guarantee it's correct or the best answer, or it could be a very good answer. It could just, like, quite often you want to think from a first principles approach, which is very specific to your business and context, that just a kind of generative AI and a language programming tool is not going to have. So I think kind of not just saying what's my buyer persona and then copying and pasting onto your website, like reading it, like playing around with it, working with the stakeholders to build on top of that, is a massively important step. And I think, like, knowing how to leverage it, knowing the prompts to use, that becomes the kind of skill set that folks will need as this technology develops.
Totally. I think that's the one thing that I've heard from so many folks, and I was asking some folks yesterday that I was meeting with, like I said, out in San Francisco, about it. Using it now as a starting point, and not necessarily blindly accepting every piece that it says to you, and over trusting it, because here's the reality of it. You're asking a machine a question, and it's going to give you an answer. There are very few times, I think some of the cool, like, poking and prodding at it right now, people are trying to find, hey, what won't it answer? And if you think about it in that context, it's going to provide you something. It's not going to return a null value, better said. And so it goes into a little bit of a trust but verify mentality. I told you I'll share my wife's point of view, and she's talked to a couple of other the partners in her law firm, and it's interesting. They kind of have a little bit of a kind of like salivating over it right now, because anytime you see such adoption of something big like this, there's so much risk assumed inside of that. So when you see it that quickly, and how quickly people are just, again, kind of blindly accepting it and using it for their own benefit, can be risky. The example they all gave, and Jack, you mentioned this a second ago, there are already active pending lawsuits for things like trademarks and copyrights. But the fun scenario or example that they used was even right now, Henry, you're about to go write a blog on a RevOps topic. Jack, you're going to write the same blog, and I'm going to write the same blog as well. We're all friends, so we're not going to point fingers at each other and say, hey, you stole my blog. But 6 months from now, what happens when somebody else writes that? And Henry, you already have published that blog on the Apollo website, or so we published it on the Sonar website. Then it does kind of become a finger pointing match. Like, well, hey, that's my content. I wrote that, and I'm publishing it, and there will be a lot of finger pointing to that. And so it's already also steering some people wrong into different avenues when they're asking questions. They're just kind of saying, no, go do this when you really should be going to do that. So again, I think the zoom out of it is when you think of the risk and reward with it, use it as a starting point. Please use it as something that can help make you more efficient. Trust but verify is probably the best cheesy line you can go with. Trust but verify, and make sure that what you're actually asking it and the return value that it's giving you is indeed the answer that you're looking for, and not something that is misinterpreted. I am seeing a lot of really fun thoughts over in the chat. Aaron, I love that. How could Aaron put a thing and said, I found it insightful when asking ChatGPT how I could use it to help me in my role. Kind of vague job description, and then asking follow-up questions based on its responsiveness. Super helpful. Those are great. And again, I think there's probably times, and Aaron, keep me honest, there's probably times that whatever it gave you, you're like, I didn't think about that approach. That's actually pretty smart. I should actually go and think about doing that for my career. And so I think that's the learning side of it, right? Like listening to it and understanding what it can actually do and how it can actually help you learn. So before I go into the next Q&A stuff, any other last thoughts or comments on just the risk side of it, or the way that y'all are thinking about leveraging it on your daily basis?
Yeah, I guess the one other thing I'll call out, and this is, it's only a problem in very limited instances, but when it is, it's a huge pain. But the data set isn't updated daily, right? Like this data is like the training data is dated at this point. So for example, I was testing it with Facebook has like an anomaly detection library, but they renamed it. But ChatGPT didn't know it was renamed, so I was trying to get this thing up and running using GPT, and it was like all wrong, right? So that's another thing to consider, is that sometimes it's out of date, and so that can be another place to stub your toe. So definitely, if it's if you're like, hey, who won the Braves game last night, it's probably not going to be very good at that. So another risky or another risk factor to watch out for.
Totally. I'll share my screen real quick, because I actually had the same risk factor happen, and it was when I was I actually used this for one of my presentations. You can actually see it on the slide. If anybody wants any of these presentations, I'm happy to share them. But the first time I asked it, my topic 2 weeks ago was optimizing your modern day Salesforce tech stack. And when I was doing it, the first thing I asked ChatGPT was, what is a GTM or what define GTM tech stack for me, like go-to-market tech stack. And it immediately went to Google Tag Manager. So acronyms actually are one of the, I would say, little blind spots, if you will. So I had to actually ask it, what is a go-to-market tech stack instead of a GTM tech stack? So there are things like that. I've also found a few of those other ones where using acronyms, it doesn't know the context of your acronym. It doesn't know that you're in the operations world or the Salesforce world. And so acronyms can be a little bit of a blind spot too. It's interesting seeing some of the things in the chat too. I have not used Bing's version of it. It looks like, Jana, I think you might have put a comment in there. Seeing how some of these other bigger platforms like Google's coming out with their own, everybody's starting to come out and leverage this into their own piece. I guess it's where we'll kind of stop in that last question. What do you think that next big chapter is? Now that everybody is really leveraging this and using this, what prediction would you make thinking about the next wave of how this technology takes over? Hard question.
I think going back to what we were talking about before with the Auto GPT, it's sort of this plug-in experience. Now that GPT can A, interact with itself, and B, quickly and easily and just like in a way that was like just a scalable approach to interacting with other applications. Um, like it, you can feed it API documentation, and then it can generate its own code to then interact with that API. So if you want it to go from like recommending a restaurant to then reaching out to the OpenTable API to create a reservation, and then, reaching out to the Google Maps API to then get directions from your house, like the sequential steps that it's now able to take for me is like, this feels like the next version of sort of like our interaction with like Web 2.0. Like we've built all these APIs, all of these applications, and now we have the sidekick that can basically traverse all of these things automatically for us, which I think is like just insanely mind-boggling. I'm so excited to see how it emerges.
Me too. Henry, what do you think? Next big wave of it where we're going to start seeing it in workflows and just how humans are using it on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the big, I think one of the like anything, what it can do exceptionally well now is save on all of those very time-consuming, monotonous tasks, and then to kind of the point Jack made, it can interact with itself and interact with APIs. So I think what we'll start seeing is it being embedded directly in product to help people like answer questions and like within the activation, the retention, the adoption cycle within a product itself, and then saying like giving some prompts back of like, okay, like you're interested in this, and then maybe it's kind of like if you ask it like what are the kind of how do I create a sequence in Apollo? So like it can tell you how it creates a sequence, but then it can give you prompts back of like who are you trying to sequence, fill in the gaps, and then give you a kind of effectively a CTA to click of like, okay, I can create this now for you if you want. And it's just like it then allows you to directly like interface and input commands into an app without having to work out that kind of like to that point Jack made right at the beginning. The reason it's taken off so well is the UI. Once you have that really, it's a super intuitive UI. Once you make an app, a platform really, really intuitive to use, then you're going to see adoption massively scale. And it's removing those kind of like rinse, repeat kind of same, like it's the evolution of the knowledge base. I think it's going to be a kind of massive shift in the way that like companies and products kind of build themselves out.
Totally. I mean, even kind of looking at what Vinny said, and appreciate the high five, man, is thinking about that. Like, I want to start baking that into products and saying things like, what will break if I go and delete this field? We've already got systems like Sonar does a lot of this when you prompt it through our current search, but how can we make it more of a human experience and start to put those prompts in as questions from a humanizing level? You're spot on. Now I
think like the kind of evolution even then is like it's not so much like what will break if I do it. It's just like behind the scenes, seeing it breaks and just fixing it for you.
Yeah.
Hey, this broke. I fixed it. Check here to review. Like that. That is all like immensely possible, and it's just kind of building that into the product and the user experience.
Totally. I think the cool part, looking at the chat too, and we'll kind of answer this and we'll wrap up from there. And any other questions, feel free to drop them in. But Liz's question is actually looking like it's getting answered by Elise in the chat. But it's interesting, like what version and level of this technology is needed for it to be useful beyond just basic questions. Last thing we'll kind of uncover is that auto GPT part, which it is sequentially polling or sequentially doing that. I can't help but start to put my my tinfoil hat on and start to say like, how far away are we from the movie AI when the robots do take over? But that is part of what is happening, not so much in a satirical like robots taking over the world, but being able to sequentially put those prompts in and it thinking about its next prompt and automatically giving you that before you even say, yes, that is the next right question, or yes, that's the next thing I'm trying to figure out, is fascinating. Again, we'll reference the All In podcast. They talked about an example of that. Hey, I need to go and take a vacation with my family up to some wineries, and I've got my children with me. Help me find the wineries, book the hotel, get the rental car, all this stuff, and it can run all the way through it, sequentially through it, which is fascinating. So I think that's the coolest part. So any last thoughts, advice that you would give to the audience, especially folks that will watch the recording of this, on how to leverage this and how to think about it in their daily practice?
I've found that upgrading to ChatGPT Plus is the easiest money you can spend if you care at all about your productivity and value your time. So I would highly encourage the upgrade. It's the best money I spend.
There you go. Jada agrees. Henry, what do you think?
I think you stole my answer, but I guess aside from that, I'd say like just like you can't break it. So like if you're not experimenting, if you're not learning like how to use it, how to kind of fold it into your kind of day to day, like there's no reason not to, right? Even like the free one is incredibly powerful. I think it's an immediate disadvantage if you're not leveraging that.
Totally. That's actually a really good point. Just before we wrap, that difference between GPT Plus and free version. Jack, I know you're bullish on it. Why? What is the big difference for the upgrade and the big value to it?
I mean, if you use GPT-4 compared to the previous models, like it's like trying to communicate with a kindergartner versus like, you know, in undergrad, like it's an order of magnitude more intelligent. So it's just a much better experience, which is crazy because the original one was already pretty amazing.
Totally. Oh, so good. Well, great conversation. Again, thank you everybody for jumping into the chat as well. Super exciting to unpack this. I think the cool part, and we'll mark our calendars, guys. We'll do this again in about 6 months and see if we can actually run an entire webinar based off of ChatGPT, and actually maybe we just get to sit back and watch ourselves talk or watch the computers talk for us. But really appreciate everybody joining. Really quick, there's some really fun new webinars that we have coming up. And of course, you can always find all these through RevOps and find us on LinkedIn to see what's coming up next. But we have some really exciting ones in May coming up, as a matter of fact, to call out. So go ahead and get excited for these and have these questions ready. But I know we talk very often about Salesforce. We're going to put our orange hat on for a minute, and we're going to talk about HubSpot. We're seeing a lot of that go through the rise in the ranks. A lot of companies starting to leverage it in different ways. And so we've got a panel of HubSpot experts coming to join on that. And the one that you certainly don't want to miss, we're actually bringing 3 C-suite members together and having them say, here is what is important to me in a RevOps lens, and here's why I invest in it. So all the RevOps folks and any operations and systems folks listening and watching, if you need the cheat sheet to hear what a CEO, a CMO, and a CRO are going to say about why they're in love with operations, stay tuned for that. So both of those are coming up in May. You'll get some emails about it. Henry, Jack, really appreciate you both jumping on. Spreading the knowledge and spreading the wealth. It's been fun. We'll get this recording up and we'll let everybody keep watching it. But really appreciate y'all's time.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great
Take care,
afternoon.
y'all.